Hi, I'm George Miliotes from Wine Bar George, and today I'm talking with Victor Ordonez about really great Spanish wine.
It's gonna be great.
It's gonna be cool.
Yeah,
you know
it's
it.
gonna be awesome.
I'd like to welcome everybody to our very first Facebook Live. We're going to be talking about really, truly great Spanish wines with Victor Ordonez from Jorge Ordonez Selections. And Victor, I think you have an upbringing that is different than anybody else in the wine business, and that you've always been being trained about Spanish wine. So what's your kind of first recollection of the business?
Honestly, really just enjoying old Gran Reserva Rioja on the dinner table when I was young, and taking little sips from my mom and dad's glasses. That's kind of my first memory. And yeah, definitely a unique upbringing, but something I feel very fortunate for, obviously.
So like you're 5 or 6 years old and getting to have a little taste?
Yeah, and just like little sips that I hated, but
Yeah,
I felt
so
pressure.
like
I felt pressure
first.
to do it. But finally learned to love wine around 15, I guess. 15 years old.
What was kind of the turning point?
I worked a harvest in Malaga in the south of Spain, where we make a dry muscat. And that was really the first wine that I fell in love with. It's called Botani, and so it's really easy drinking, but also really aromatic and a lot of acidity, and that was a wine that I really fell in love with at an early age.
And when did red wine start to come onto the
Red wine
table?
was really like sophomore year of college, honestly, and then really fell in love junior year of college with tasting wine and learning about wine and doing a lot of reading and stuff and educating myself, I guess. But I'm kind of later than most people expect.
But I think in your family, because your family is food and wine obsessed, I'm sure some of that had to sink in over
Yeah, I mean,
over time.
Cooking is huge in my house. Very traditional Spanish upbringing, lots of family meals. My sister and I essentially grew up as the sous chefs for my dad in the kitchen. I don't know how many cloves of garlic I peeled in my lifetime. So yeah, I mean, cooking was also huge, and gourmet food was a big thing at the dinner table growing up. So.
Awesome. So I'd like to remind everybody, since we are live, if there are questions you have about Spanish wine, because I can guarantee you, Victor probably
anything
has
you
the
guys want to
answer.
know. Yeah, anything you guys want to know.
We can do that for you, and don't be shy. Let us know what you'd like to hear about. But I know that red wine now is kind of, I don't know about an obsession, but I love Spanish red wine, and I think when I think about where the market is with Spanish wine, they make truly some of the greatest wines in the world, but there's also this middle ground retail-wise, where wines are in mid-teens to low 20s retail price-wise,
Yeah,
whereas
absolutely.
Spain makes awesome wine.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest things, people always think about Spain as a really good value wine-producing country. And unfortunately, I think most people hear value and think really good $8, $6 bottles of wine. When you're right, I think the real sweet spot is that even $18, $16 to $45 price point, where Spain is making some absolutely outstanding wines. And the reason for that is that land is cheap, vineyards are cheap, and the initial capital investment for making a great winery and starting to produce some great wines is relatively low compared to other regions like Napa, where a single vineyard planted in 1900, 10 acres, how much would that sell for? A couple $1 million
It'd
easily.
be crazy.
So you can buy a vineyard like that in Spain for 20,000 euros, no problem.
So I can buy a vineyard with 100-year-old vines on it for...
Yeah, 10, 20,000 euros. And that's that initial, just like we did with Vatan, which is a single vineyard planted in 1900. And that's the kind of thing that makes Spain really special, because that initial capital investment from a winery point of view is very low. So you can make some outstanding wines at the $45 price point, or the $25 or $16 price point that's really unrivaled by anything else in the world.
And so age of vines, you talked about having 100-year-old vine. How does that work into the situation of making better wine? Why would I want older vines?
Older vines typically have much deeper root systems, which adds a lot of complexity to the wines, because there's a huge amount of mineral uptake from the root system, and the lower you go, the more minerals the vine's going to be picking up and ultimately transferring to the grapes. On top of that, you have much lower yields, so grapevines that produce per vine fewer grapes and smaller bunches, which produces more concentrated, intense juice. and more character in the more authentic old clones of Spain's indigenous grapes, which is ultimately what makes Spain special. There's thousands of different clones of Pinot Noir, as you know, and there's also thousands of different clones of Tempranillo, and a Tempranillo that is genetically modified to yield 5 to 10 times what it should in a lab that was produced 3 years ago. That's not really high quality Tempranillo, right? So those original clones are what we try to make wine with. And obviously if you work with an older vineyard, that's a more original and authentic expression of an indigenous grape.
And so are there certain regions within Spain where you find a preponderance of old vines? Or
Toro is the biggest one, and so it's great that we're going to be talking about Toro, that we have having this conversation. That was a nice little segue.
I'm trying. So what makes Toro special? I know that in some of the things that we've learned about, it's sandy soils that make this.
Yeah, so Toro is the only region in Spain that completely resisted the phylloxera, which, as you know, is a plague that swept through Europe at the end of the 19th century. And the phylloxera is a louse, a small bug that eats grapevine roots. And so it was a plague that swept through Europe at the end of the 19th century, wiped out 60 to 70% of all the vineyards in Europe. But this particular louse does not survive in sandy soils. So the result of that is that Toro, which is all sandy soils, completely resisted this plague. And as a result, you have probably the highest concentration of original European root and very, very old vineyards in the entire world, the highest concentration that you can find of old vines and ungrafted vineyards.
And so the root thing being on their original root, what is that?
So when the phylloxera swept through Europe, the grape growers' response to that plague was to take American roots and replant the European vine on American roots, because the phylloxera is native to the Americas, and as a result, American roots are resistant to the phylloxera. So in Toro, you have those original European rootstocks that weren't transferred, so you get a much more authentic old world expression of these varieties.
It's very cool. And we have our first question from Kieran, wondering why we think we get such a high quality in Spain and a lower price comparative to other.
It's a good question. I think, like I said, the most important thing is that initial capital investment of creating a great wine is much lower. If you want to, purchase an old vineyard, you can do it for relatively cheap. If you were to purchase a very, very old vineyard that had substantial area in Napa, for example, you'd have to drop a couple $1 million easily.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a given. But in Spain, you can do it for a couple thousand. And so that initial capital investment is very, very low. And then on top of that, labor is cheaper and everything. But on top of that, obviously, the matter of supply and demand comes into play. And if Spanish wines are slightly more unknown, I wouldn't say Spanish wines are unknown. They're the third or fourth highest imported wine into the United States. I think it's France, Italy, Argentina, then Spain. But demand is still lower for Spanish wines than it is for French wines. Well, so obviously that comes into play as well.
I think this plays into our conversation because I think about Toro, and I think probably the greatest red wine buy in the world today, whether it's on a wine list or retail, is the Triton that we have here, that it might be fun to taste. But to talk to Kieran's question, for $18 retail, maybe $20 retail, it comes from mostly 100-year-old vines?
Yeah, so this is a selection of 10 different vineyard sites planted between 80 and 100 years ago. Okay. So, I mean, that's extremely, extremely old. And like we were saying, from a more well-known region, from a Napa Valley.
From Napa, it'd be $300
It would be $300 a bottle for that material,
yes.
For that genetic material that you're getting, which, like I said, is such a unique expression of Tempranillo, which is the grape that is used to make Triton. And I think that's the most important thing, right? You get really, really high quality, authentic viticulture at a very low price. So.
And now, when you vinify this wine, is there anything special we do in the winery? Does it get oak aging? What's
So this is fermented in small 5,000 liter stainless steel vats. So the idea there is to keep the fermentation size relatively small, so we can control each different vineyard fermentation very, very closely. And then after that, we only macerate for 8 days, which is very, very low. A typical red wine maceration might last 25, 30 days.
And what is maceration?
Maceration is when you are producing a red wine. Basically, you take a barrel. Imagine this is a vat with an open cover. You dump the grapes in and you let them sit there. And the reason you do that is to extract the red color from the skins into the wine. Because if you were to crush the grapes, the juice that would come out would be whitey, pinkish type color.
We'd be making white Tempranillo.
Exactly, like white Zinfandel.
So you said this is just 8 days compared to 30 days, but I look at how dense the color is on this. I can't see through it.
And the reason for that is that because you have such old vines, the the yields are very, very low per vine, like I was talking about, and the berries are extremely small. So the grapes here, where your regular table grape at from a supermarket would be that big, the grapes here look like blueberries. They're very, very tiny, so you have a huge ratio of skins to pulp, which means that extraction and getting color and tannins and phenolic compounds and aromatics is not the issue, right? The issue is controlling that extraction. And so we only do an 8-day maceration because that's all you really need with a wine that's this good.
Well, I think the thing is, does it taste good or not?
Cheers.
Right? So cheers. Let's see what's going on here.
The wines of Toro are undoubtedly big. They're always going to have massive concentration and structure and color. But I think the best wines of Toro also show some signs of elegance and have a really nice acidity on the palate that leaves the palate feeling clean even though the wine's so big.
It's funny. I get blue and black fruit out of this. Maybe a little of that blueberry. Maybe as you said blueberry, it's in my mind, but blue and black fruit. But it is still exciting in the back palate that makes me want to have another.
Yeah, and the aromatics are really pretty. I think especially, this is the 16 vintage, which was very dry, so perhaps not as ripe as other vintages because the grapevines actually shut down physiologically because there wasn't a lot of rain. But you get a more perfumed style of Toro than you would typically get from this region with this vintage.
Well, it's delicious. Now, once it finishes its fermentation,
then it spends depending on the vintages, 6 to 8 months in used French oak barrels. So barrels that are this size, 225 liters, and barrels that are 3 times this size, 600 liters more or less. And for that, we do that for 6 months. And the idea there is to not really impart any overt flavor of oak, but it's to soften the palate, soften the tannins, add an elegance to the wine and a complexity and an ageability. But we use used barrels that don't have a lot of actual flavor of oak.
And so when we get to a barrel that's used and neutral as opposed to used and maybe still having some flavor, the barrels are 5 years old, 2 years old, 10 years old?
The barrels for this are 2nd through 5th use barrels.
Okay. And we got a couple more questions.
Awesome.
From Cindy, let's see. Maybe we don't have another question, but I am saying hi to Cindy. So hi, Cindy. I hope you're enjoying good Spanish wine. And so you talked about. I think this is like when I think about wine that Americans would really, really like and could understand. Like when I have a steak, I think that this is as good a wine as there could be.
This is perfect ribeye wine.
Yes.
And I think the way
ribeye wine, absolutely.
The way I think about Spanish wines or introducing people to Spanish wines is that it's a wine from the old world, from Europe, an area that's been growing grapes for over 3,000 years and making wine for perhaps longer. But because it's such a warm country and because it's Europe's 2nd highest country in elevation, the wines always show tons of fruit. So you kind of have wines that have New World fruit with Old World character and acidity, minerality, and intensity. And as a result, I think they're really good gateway wines for a lot of people who are New World wine drinkers who want to try something a little different, but perhaps don't want to go to something that's all earthy and animal notes.
But
it's a good gateway wine.
I'll be more direct. Like, if you like Cabernet, but you always drink Cabernet, this is the perfect wine to
Absolutely.
give you an entree into the old world and still have some traits that are familiar because it is big, it is bold. I think the tannins here are really, really ripe and beautiful. And I think about going to a restaurant or throwing, as you said, a ribeye on the grill. Man,
oh yeah, it's perfect. And you're getting this for $50 on the restaurant wine list. So the price is fantastic as well.
Okay, and so this came from 80 to 100-year-old vines, but I know you make other wines in Toro. Is there what's the continuum there, and what should I expect as I move up the?
So we make Triton is the entry-level wine, like I said. Still a relatively small production, about 6,000 cases, which is relatively small. And then the flagship wine of the winery is called Vatan, which is a single vineyard planted in 1900. So very, very old vineyard, all planted on ungrafted rootstocks.
All right, let me stop you there.
Yes.
So how do we know that it was planted in 1900?
The back label says so.
Okay.
But that's why.
No, but I mean, when you and your dad are going to buy a vineyard.
Yeah.
Is it the guy who owns it said, "Oh, I think the vines were planted in
1900?
No,
no. So actually, there's government certified papers that show plantation dates actually, and so that's how we know. And so we have those. Sometimes it's a matter of the old timer who sold you the vineyard says, oh, my great grandfather planted it, so it's between 190 years old. But in this case, we actually have government certified papers showing the official plantation date in 1900.
Interesting.
But it's a wine with tons of character, tons of elegance, and the philosophy was a little bit to make a really Bordelais style of Toro. Something that has all the ripe fruit that Toro is known for because it's a hot region, but a wine with tons of really, really elegant structure, and a wine that ultimately will last very, very long.
And so when you say Bordelais style, you mean have ageability to the wine?
Yeah, ageability, really good structure, and it's really easy in Toro to make a fruit bomb because it's a really lush, ripe, plump fruit bomb, but trying to do something that has more structure and seriousness and a more serious profile with acidity, with structure, not something that's just made for immediate consumption, and to try to target the widest market possible with just fruit.
Yeah. And so this is specific vineyard, and now are there specific parcels of that vineyard that maybe are better, or? Yeah,
and so the middle of this vineyard, we have 6 rows in the middle of this vineyard that we believe might have been planted before 1900 because there are these 6 rows that have a high proportion of stone in the soil, and the vines seem to be much larger than all the vines around them. So we think that they might have been planted an extra 10 or 20 years earlier, and we vinified those specific 6 rows into a wine called Vatan Arena, which means sand. Arena means sand, and the reason we named it sand is because those sandy soils are the reason why this region resisted the phylloxera, and really what makes this region such a special part of Spanish viticulture. We only vinified 2,000 bottles of that wine, and most of it is being sold in Spain. It's a very, very exclusive high-end bottling that we make, but that's kind of for us the ultimate expression of the original clone of Tempranillo that's cultivated in Toro.
And now, has Toro been making Tempranillo as long as, like we think of Rioja as the main region of Spain?
Yeah, but Tempranillo actually originates from Rioja. So all the all the Tempranillo in Ribera del Duero and Rioja and La Mancha, all those are originally come from Toro and are genetic offshoots from the original clone of Toro, which is of Tempranillo, which is known locally as Tinta de Toro, the red wine grape from Toro. These are the red wines that were actually the most famous red wines in medieval Spain. The medieval capital of Spain was not in Madrid, but it was in a city called Valladolid, which is right near Toro. And so the medieval kings of Spain drank these wines. These are actually the red wines that Columbus brought on his boats with him to the New World.
Really,
yeah,
truly?
Actually, yeah.
That's
we have
crazy.
Primary source records showing that. And they were the only red wines that were able to be consumed across regional borders in medieval Spain without import taxes. So let's say, you're a master somm in medieval Sevilla, and you want to buy some Toro, you could buy that wine without any import taxes, but if you wanted to buy Rioja, you would have to pay an import tax because the wines were so valued. And that's kind of why Jorge originally said, I want to go to Toro and really resuscitate this region, which he did in 1995.
So we had another question come in about how can we, as a manager, or if you're building a wine list, what do we do to make sure that Spanish wines get sold? Because people come in and they want to buy Cabernet or Pinot Noir from
I think it's forming those relationships with your consumers, getting to know what they like, and then after the 16th time that they order their Cabernet from Napa Valley, you say if they're looking to try something else or if they're interested in something else, you can go to Spanish wines because they show so much attractive fruit that mimics the wines of the New World in some way, but they have so much else going on in the back. And so I think that's kind of the way you find your consumers who are interested in these wines, you get to know what they like, and then you slowly start to introduce them. And after a while, most consumers, I think, will be adventurous enough to try them. And the quality of the wine speaks for itself a lot of the time. Sometimes I even have to force people to say, just try it already, and they take a sip and they say, oh, I love it, I'm gonna get a bottle. I was doing a food and wine seminar at Disney at Epcot yesterday, and introducing varietals that, esoteric Spanish varietals like Godello that were almost extinct at the end of the 1980s. A varietal that none of the 100 people in the audience had ever tried before, and we sold almost 3 cases of the wine just from that one seminar. So the wines show really well, the wines are delicious, it's just a matter of getting them in people's glasses and forming that relationship with your customers so that they trust you when you say, here, do me a favor and try this.
And I'll piggyback with you on that. Getting the bottle open and giving somebody a little taste, I think
it's the most important thing.
In the glass,
it's the most important thing.
So you spend an ounce of wine on a guest, allowing them to try. I think they taste this and they're going to be like, yeah, it's something new and something different. And everybody, I think, loves things
of course,
that are new and different. And so you brought up an interesting point, though, that I want to ask. like your father saw the vision with Albarino back in the late 80s.
Yeah, Jorge was the
90s.
first person to import Albarino to the United States. He was the first person to import Godello. He was the first person to import Chacoli, Jumilla, Monastrell, all these, Toro.
And so is
Garnacha actually he was the first. Priorat, he was the first.
So what do we think the immediate future is? Is Toro our big thing, or are there other regions?
Toro's our very special region, and with a wine like Vatan, I'm always educating about this wine and always bringing it out, always showing, always tasting customers on this wine, because I think it's one of the most special wines we have in our portfolio. But we represent 128 different wines from across Spain, most of which are produced with Spanish indigenous varieties. And I think continuing to educate consumers and wine buyers to make them understand, what really Spain is authentically. Unfortunately, now everyone seems to have a Spanish wine. It's not like it was 20 years ago. We were the one of 3 players in the field. Now everyone carries Spanish wines, and I think my goal now is to continue the education so that buyers and consumers know how to weed through the bad examples of Spanish wine and to steer themselves towards the high quality ones.
All right, so we had another question from Peter, and can we compare these wines to similar, more familiar wines? Are they like something else? And as I said earlier in the thing, like in the presentation, the Triton from Toro, if I have a Cabernet drinker or a Merlot drinker, I'm not afraid to say, hey, try this, here's something new, fun,
Absolutely,
and different.
yeah.
You're talking about Godello, a white wine that...
Godello is really reminiscent, when it's done well, of high quality white Burgundy. Yeah. So Chardonnay from Burgundy.
I think there are kind of ways that you can keep people in their comfort zone, but
Tons
still show them something really different, delicious, and new that they're going to love.
Verdejo is Spain's version of Sauvignon Blanc, essentially, too. There are tons of comparisons.
So Kieran has another question for us. Thank you very much for being for asking questions. Do you grow any Garnacha in Toro?
No, we don't.
So where do
there's small amounts of Garnacha grown in Toro, but it's not a grape that's indigenous to Toro. So it's typically used for lower quality bulk bottlings where they just need volume and they need higher yielding grapes, because Tinta de Toro is very low yielding.
But I know there are a lot of really good Garnacha-based wines that you represent. So what region would we go to for that?
Those you go to the autonomous province of Aragon, which is located about 2 hours to the northeast of Madrid. Jorge, like I was saying, was the first person to introduce Garnacha to the United States with a winery called Bodegas Borsao. Which we still represent in the United States today, and they're one of our most important partners. They're located in Campo de Borja, which is the homeland of Garnacha. We also own a winery called Bodegas Breca, which is located in a region called Calatayud, a very complex name. And that's a very special winery for us because it's located in Spain's highest altitude mountain region for the cultivation of Garnacha. So this is all Garnacha that we grow, planted between 1900 and 1970. For Breca, the flagship wine, it's all vineyards planted between 120 and 80 years ago, and all vineyards located at above 1,000 meters above sea level. So in Calatayud, for example, in the growing season in July, you might have growing conditions where at midday you're at 105 degrees Fahrenheit, and at night you're at 35 degrees Fahrenheit.
I've been in Spain where it's like freezing, and then the sun comes up. It goes from
and that's what
freezing
you get,
to 90.
And that's what you get from high altitude climates. Why does that affect the wine, or how does it impact the wine? You get wines with tons of ripeness and fruit and structure from all the heat, but also wines with really, really good acidity and elegance from the cool nights.
And so you mentioned Breca as a flagship, but Breca retails for
retails for 16 to 18 bucks. And that's one of our flagship Garnachas in the portfolio, and one of the best value Garnachas coming out of Spain today.
So that is truly awesome. There's so many, really. We could talk for another...
We could do another seminar on Garnacha.
A whole another hour just on Garnacha, and the Garnachas that y'all make, but you make as wide a range from things that are $8 a bottle to retail all the way to
120. Yeah. I think Garnacha is a grape that Jorge wanted to bring to the United States because at the time in 1987, when he started importing wines to the United States, Garnacha was actually Spain's most widely planted red grape, not Tempranillo. And even within the country, the Guia Peñín, which is Spain's version of the Wine Spectator, lambasted the grape as cheap, oxidative, you couldn't age, it was low quality, funky. And now we produce beautiful high-end Garnachas that age amazingly well because the grape has phenomenal natural acidity. And acidity is one of the most important things for aging.
Awesome. Well, I'll tell you what, this is up. We got one more question.
Nice.
somebody who's asking, have you tasted Tempranillo from the United States, where I think in Texas and some in Washington State people are making it? Do you think there's a future for Tempranillo
I have
there?
never tasted one from California or Washington, but I've tasted one from Texas, which was interesting. Different expression of Tempranillo. Actually, trying to piggyback, I think one of the most perfect marketing ideas, which was come up, the idea came from our head of chain sales, Jack Guinan, would be to make a wine called Monastrell, with the Monastrell grape in Arizona, because Arizona resembles exactly some of the regions like Jumilla and Alicante where we make phenomenal Monastrell. So I think that's
So maybe we need to go out to Arizona,
let's do it.
buy
Yeah,
some
exactly.
vineyard land and go into
plant
business.
some Monastrell. Yeah,
I'm up for that.
for sure, man.
All right, well, I want to thank everybody for joining Victor and I today on the first ever Facebook Live that we've done. Please remember, this was the first one. We'd love any feedback or questions that you have, because we want to do great things. If there are other subjects that you'd like us to talk about, we're hip to doing that. But thank you again, and thank you to Victor, because
Thanks, George.
you know I love Spanish wine. It's always great talking and drinking.
Thanks
with
so
you.
much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, everybody.
Cheers.